Gotcha. Okay.
If you
All
want
right.
to.
Yeah.
So my name's Bill Warren. I'm the CEO of Peeps Democracy, which is a collaborative finance platform run on the blockchain using cryptocurrencies. I graduated from Duke in 2016 at the law school. So I'll turn it over to Jen to go next.
Thanks, Bill. I'm Jennifer Byrne. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Quesnay. That's Queusnay. I know it's an interesting name. Google it. You'll see it's a French economist, philosopher. So that's your trivia for the day. We are a boutique innovation consulting firm, and we primarily run innovation competitions to really connect startups into the corporate environment to really drive innovation and new thinking. Our clients are corporations, but our applicants and technology providers are really the startups. So we kind of sit in between. We currently have open the Female Founders and InsurTech Innovation Competition that's really trying to help more women-led startups in insurance get connected to investors and carriers and reinsurers. So if you know any good female entrepreneurs, let me know. They can apply, and looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic.
And we'll go to Charles next.
Oh goodness, you're putting me on the spot here. So
Yeah.
I was lurking in here to listen to the dulcet tones. I'm actually stealing Lee's recording here, and I'm going to repackage it with my baby Einstein knockoff. And so, anyway, Charles Potts, Senior Vice President and Chief Innovation Officer with the Independent Community Bankers of America, and a longtime friend with Lee and a co-worker at a couple of different occasions. And unfortunately for you guys, Georgia Tech alum. So anyway, good to meet you guys today.
Yeah, great to meet you too.
Excellent.
And then Vadim will go to you, and then I'll let Jen do a quick intro of Lee.
Sounds good. Vadim Polakov, Duke undergrad and grad alum. I am the CEO of Legends of Learning, which is a game-based learning platform that sells into schools and school districts, and also into corporations and for consumers as well. I'm a big fan of Duke entrepreneurship, and I've started a few companies with a few exits in the past as well. We are venture backed, and we'll be going out for our Series B in the next couple of months. Yeah, so always happy to hear another Duke alum who's an entrepreneur, speaker, and support Duke entrepreneurship.
Excellent.
Awesome. Yeah, Jen, do you want to do a quick intro of Lee? Or?
Sure, yeah, and Lee, obviously you can add, but thank you for, again, making the time. As you might have seen in Bill's email, Lee is the Director of Strategic Insight for Jack Henry and Associates, and directs the development of actionable insight and strategy for financial services. In addition to being now kind of a corporate leader, I guess, Lee is also an entrepreneur, and we're definitely looking forward to hearing that journey. Lee had previously shared a little bit with me. So with that, thanks, Lee. I'll let you further introduce yourself and kick off the discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jen. Thanks for everybody for joining. And I'm really happy and honored to have this conduit back to the alma mater and to be with you guys here today. So just to give you some additional background on me and why I would be in this setting outside of just being a Duke alum. After leaving Duke and wandering around for a while, I'll spare you the wanderings, but I ended up back at home. And home for me is a small town in South Central Georgia called Hahira. This was back in the mid 90s, early 90s. To give you more background, my father was a farmer and a banker, and he was president of a tiny little bank in this one red light town, Hahira, in South Central Georgia. And he bamboozled a very talented friend of his named David Peterson, who was one of these extraordinary people who had both a lot of vision and just unparalleled communication capabilities with technical capabilities. And David was a serial entrepreneur, but had wanted to settle down so he could see his kids every once in a while. And my dad had given him the pitch to come to this small little town and be a vice president of this little bank, and he would see his kids every day and everything would be great. And David took the bait, and when he did, as soon as he stepped foot inside of that little bank, he started identifying and then resolving technologically problems in the back room of that bank, specifically problems with payments and payments files and how they get manipulated in the back and how they get cleared and processed and et cetera. And very quickly, word got out about these little batch files and software programs that David was writing in the back of this little bank. And suddenly a startup was born, a payments startup. And so not too long after that got going in earnest in the back room of that little bank in Hayhire, Georgia, I had left, gone to Duke, was in Atlanta, pursuing other things. And I got the pitch, in essence, to come back and help get that off the ground. Started out writing software documentation. That was back when you had manuals that would tell you how to actually operate software and that kind of thing. We would call that a payments fintech today, but back then we didn't have the fintech language. It was just a payments startup that grew out of the back room of that little bank in Hayhire, Georgia, and quickly grew. I'll spare you the 2 or 3 M&As that happened over the years, but through those, it turned into what was Goldleaf Technologies. The name of that startup turned into Goldleaf Financial Solutions, a publicly traded company, about an $80 million publicly traded company. And that company got acquired in 2009 by Jack Henry. And Jack Henry is where I now work. Jack Henry is my employer. To give you background on that, just again, for perspective, Jack Henry is one of the big 3, as they're called, in financial technology or bank technology. We would be considered one of the this is more negative in connotation, but the legacy core providers. So the major providers of the core accounting software and systems that drive every bank and credit union in the country, we're one of those big providers. We're the 3rd in size. Fiserv and FIS are the other 2. But in addition to core systems, we offer everything technologically that banks and credit unions need to do what they do. So that includes digital banking solutions, lending platforms, payments platforms of every kind, security, cyber, you name it. It's under our umbrella at Jack Henry. My job at Jack Henry, even though I started out in that kind of startup setting in the back room of that little bank in Hayhire, Georgia, back in the early 90s, I've worn several different hats over the years, but by the time we were acquired by Jack Henry in 2009, I had started to do more strategy work and to share the results of that strategy work by way of, keynotes and writing and articles and that kind of thing. And so I'm now a strategy person, basically at Jack Henry, and I'm the generalist. We have a team of strategic analysts at Jack Henry who track sort of every vertical inside of financial services and financial technology. And I get the benefit from their deeper analyses in those given areas. And then I connect the dots as the generalist between those different areas. And the end game for me is to read the tea leaves. And I've been around long enough now so that if I were to shortcut a description of what I do day in and day out, I'm a meta analyst. So I'm analyzing the analysts that analyze the industry. We also do some of our own primary research, but I'm looking for where there's data-driven consensus on things and where there's not. I find the areas where there's no consensus at all the most fun areas to dive into and to connect dots and try to generate meaningful analysis of my own. And then the product of all that is this meta-analysis that I share with the industry in a number of different settings, as well as our executives internally at Jack Henry, helping them do gap analysis on where they're taking their relative business lines and making sure they're aligned to where things seem to be going over the next 3 to 5 years. So anyway, that's who I am, what I do, where I am, and how I got there. And Jen, I'm open to go in any direction you want to go. Charles can tell you I have no shortage of words and opinions. So
yeah, I think the interesting story that we talked about was just how you went from, entrepreneurship and then successfully, exiting, being acquired, and oftentimes those don't work very well.
right.
So I feel like it's a very compelling story to kind of share why did that work well and why are you still with the company? More often than not, the entrepreneurs will leave the mothership, so to speak. So I think that would be cool to hear about.
Yeah. So let me go. I'll go a little deeper. So there were these nepotistic roots, right, in my connection to that startup that grew out of that little bank. My dad was president of that bank. And so of course I had a connection to him, and I had a connection through him to David Peterson, the sort of the brains behind that startup. And I never imagined, I'll just tell you this personally, once I had left Duke and I'd done some graduate work at Emory and I was in Atlanta and I was doing things, I never in a million years would have imagined going back to Hayhire, Georgia for any reason at all, ever. And so to do that, to get pitched, to come back, there were some other things that factored in that. My dad was having some health issues at the time. So there was a little bit of like, I was compelled to kind of want to be there, just to be there for him and to help out and that. But I was there long enough to where it was like, oh wow, this group is really onto something here. And what they were onto was the need for the average community bank in the United States to be able to play meaningfully in electronic payments and what we call ACH transactions, right? ACH is still around today. We have many more rails these days. But that's really what we worked on. That's really what we tried to perfect, was making it easy for financial institutions who had no expertise in payments whatsoever, and really didn't really understand the rules governing all the complexity of rules governing ACH transactions and returns and the timeframes for those and managing credit risk, temporal risk around that, et cetera. And so that's where we went. That's where I did my deep dive. I cut my teeth on payments. And that's where I started. So I wrote all the software manuals. Then from there, I started, we were going out and installing the software. This is way before cloud and software as a service. We would go out and install the software locally at the banks, train them on the software, et cetera. I was doing that for a while, and then we kept growing. And then I hired and managed up a pool of third-party or independent consultants who would go out and do these installations and training at banks. And over the course of that, we by the way, as a startup, this might be interesting. This is something that we figured out the hard way. How do we get, you've got the software now, there's value in it, but how do you get people to pay you for it? How do you get the attention of the right people at the banks? Because the people who knew the value of the software at banks were the operations personnel, but the operations personnel in banks don't pull the trigger on technology spend at banks. So this is what we learned. And I know Charles is going to be laughing when he hears all this because he knows it, but David Peterson and I, we just hit the road, and we offered ourselves for free to these regional payment associations across the country and said, hey, we'll come and we'll do an all-day, like nuts to bolts seminar on everything you need to know as a bank to play in electronic payments, right? Everything that you need to know. We'll take you through it. 8 hours. These were 8-hour seminars, right? And we'll come, and the payment associations, they would sell, registrations to these events, and we would come in and do them for free. We wouldn't pitch product because we knew we didn't have to. We would just take them through all the complexity that they needed to navigate to do payments. And at the end of the day, they would think, wow, man, I wish there was software or something out there that made all this easier. Right? And then we would go, ta-da, here we are. Guess what we have?
But wait, there's more.
But wait, there's more. Exactly. So here's the interesting thing. And I don't know that I know I've talked to Charles about it in other private settings, but when this went gang, we could not beat back the demand from regional payment associations across the country for what we were doing, because one, we knew what we were talking about, and two, we were mildly amusing. And in banking, that means you're a rock star. I don't know if you guys know this, but if you go to a banking conference, you're going to be preceded by an accountant, a regulator, and an economist. So you are just primed for rock stardom if you are mildly amusing in those settings, right? And we figured that out over time. We figured out that if you could teach bankers something that they didn't know that was of value, could generate revenue for them, and you were mildly amusing, that was something that there was no end of demand for. So much so that we ended up eventually dipping our toe in the water of monetizing demand just for the value of the education we were creating. So these, you know, and I was the one to do that. I said, David, don't you think these people would at least pay our travel to go do these seminars? He said, I don't know. You think they would? I was like, let me ask them. And I would ask, right? And they would say, well, yeah, because they're making whatever, $20,000, $30,000 a pop every time we dropped in somewhere to do one of these seminars. And eventually that led, I apologize, that led to the realization that demand was the way to invert what had been the most difficult thing for us to overcome as a startup, which was we were doing all those little RPA like meetings and seminars, but we were never invited to the big meeting, the big annual convention, right? The big, and then if you want, and because to do that, you typically had to pay to play, right? You're a vendor, you're looking to sell something, you have to pay us $5,000 or $10,000 or $15,000 to be in front of this group of decision makers for 2 minutes when you sponsor a lunch, right? You get up like a dweeb and you say, I'm Lee Wetherington from Gold Leaf. Man, we sure would like it if you would buy our software. And everybody, they wouldn't even look up, they're eating their meal and you pay $1,000 for a lunch. And what we realized though, is that's the wrong way to go about it. Instead, we developed something, we decided to go all in on this area of delivering new content, authoritative content that they did not know that they needed to know and that they could monetize in terms of revenue and be mildly amusing doing it. And people started paying us to keynote their conferences. So, and we wouldn't pitch product, we were just up there and we had now the main stage for an hour and our logo down at the bottom of each visual, right? And that turned out, and we tracked sales within 3 to 6 months of every one of those keynotes we started doing a long time ago. And that, and Charles can tell you that was the start of Gold Leaf being much bigger in the way it was perceived in the industry than its actual footprint in the industry.
Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. So
I wanted to ask you this question, Lee, and we've known each other a long time, but I think this is a prescient question for the crew. Given that experience and looking at a lot of the trends you and I both have been part of in our years in this industry,
right?
Do you see some correlation of that evangelism to other new, and since we're kind of narrowly focused on fintech, other new fintech, right? The evolution of technology in our space. Are you, as regulated as it is, do we still have room for that kind of evangelism and education?
Yeah, I absolutely know that's the case. And you see it taking form now, at least in the pandemic, it's taking form in podcasts, right? So it took me 25 years to deliver 600 keynotes, right? It took me, I think, 4 months to deliver what feels like 600 podcasts.
Yeah.
And what if you pay attention to those social media circles and that we inhabit, Charles, in the industry, you see that vying. Now everybody and their mother has a podcast, right?
Don't talk about my mother's podcast.
but the question it always is it's about the attention economy inside of those circles, right? Who is getting the most attention? Who is saying the things that are the newest, that are the most meaningful, that are backed up the most authoritatively? And you see that those people's opinions and their appearances on podcasts and their appearances on keynote stages, if the conference circuit ever comes back, those are the ones who are commanding the lion's share of evangelism in that industry. Now, what you still don't see, and what is really, really unique, is you still don't see many pure play, quote unquote, vendors being able to thread the needle between just telling you something because this is authentically what I think is right and true and good that you don't know yet, versus trying to tell you that in a way that's going to pitch you and pivot you to buy our stuff later, right? There are very few people. I mean, here's the thing. It's one thing to be mildly amusing. It's another thing to just be authentic and unapologetic about it. Because, and this is the beauty, Charles, and you know this, and you were responsible for this at different points in my career. But the beauty of the chances that I got going from startup to a larger company, now to acquired by even a bigger company, is that I've never had my wings clipped. And I've used my platform to say things that make the people I work for really uncomfortable.
Thank you very much.
I mean, and you know that. I mean, very uncomfortable. That is the only reason I have the currency that I have in the circles that I travel and the platforms that I use to speak or whatever, is because people know they're just going to get it straight. And it may or may not cut well for my employer. But my employer, thank goodness, gets it, that the authenticity, and this gets to your question of evangelism. The currency of the evangelism gets down to value and authenticity. That's it. Those two things. And if you can do those two things and you can be mildly amusing, then you can write your ticket and your platform will be as big as you need it to be to do and accomplish whatever you want to accomplish, even if it's indirect to what you're saying in the moment you're on a platform of any kind. And that's what I've learned over time. I would say this, so there's a lot of evangelism going on. What is still rare is for a fintech, for a startup, for a company that's looking to sell product to be able to do that dance.
Yeah.
So that you can be both authentic and also have your cake and eat it too, because you believe so thoroughly in where you are and the innovation that you've brought to bear, that if you completely believe that if you just educate them as to the needs, they'll find their way to you, even if it's not directly from that presentation, right? Or that whatever podcast appearance or keynote speech or article that you wrote, et cetera. So that to me is the trick. And I gotta pay attention to the time here. When I have startup young, bright, innovator types coming to me and saying, how do you see the world? What would you have wanted to know back in 1990, whatever, to get you to where you are now? And I tell them this: for any domain in which you are working and or you're learning, how many people in that domain really know what they're talking about? Okay, so you go from this to this. Who in my domain really knows, cold, knows that domain? And you've got to at least get in that domain. I would say for anybody beginning a career in anything, you've got to go deep somewhere. I cut my teeth in payments, that's where. So I became a payments expert, right? Okay, great. how many of those people can actually clearly communicate the knowledge of that domain that they have? Right, now we get smaller, right? How many of those people can hold the attention of a room for an hour? Smaller. How many people of those people can leave a room and everybody in that room is desperate to spend more time with you to know more about what you were talking about? Even smaller. If you look at those concentric circles, I tell people that you want to get to that smallest circle. And then it doesn't really matter what the domain is, what the vertical is, what the industry is. If you get to that smallest concentric circle, you will be able to accomplish almost anything because of the economy of attention and how it's mediated. Has always been mediated, but how it's mediated specifically now in terms of social media and digital settings. So.
That's awesome. Thank you. Always good seeing you. Thank you for letting me crash your party here, guys.
Hey, no, I appreciate it. It's good to see you, Charles. Always. Yeah.
See you guys.
Yeah.
As someone who has that kind of meta picture of the fintech world and payments world, where are you seeing the kind of most exciting innovations and startups?
Yeah. So let me tell you, I'm going to pull back a little bit further out than just specific startups, and we can name names in just a minute. But I would tell you that the most significant shift happening right now in financial technology and financial services is the shift away from digital technology being reduced to self-service. This is important. So this is one of the things that we've that the pandemic has really put into stark relief. Are two, three things. One is, yes, digital is not optional anymore for any business. Okay, especially in money, especially in finance. Digital is not optional, but self-service is also not sufficient. So the rub and the problem with the way technology has been applied in banking is that we have, since the advent of the ATM, primarily levered technology to affect self-service. And this is existentially problematic for community banks and community credit unions whose business models are relationship-based business models. You can't have now I think most banks and credit unions would say, yeah, my primary way of connection to customers, if you're a bank, members, if you're a credit union, is through digital channels. But guess what? We are not there. That is, the people inside the bank or the people inside the credit union are not inside the digital channel for our customers and members. It's all self-service. Andy Grove, the pioneer of PCs and semiconductors, he said, I think what he said was really, really prescient. He said that when products and services become largely indistinguishable from each other, all there is by way of competitive advantage is time, right? So I think that's a really good kind of summary of where we are right now in banking, in so much as most digital banking looks, feels, and smells the same, right? There's not a whole lot of differentiation there. And the reason for that commoditization of digital banking is because all of it, historically speaking, has been reduced to self-service. Now, the shift that has happened relative to that context, and this is really new. In fact, it began, I can give you a month and day, in October of 2018, two really innovative groups of technologists brought to bear and published live and in the wild in the banking industry for the first time digital banking that translated local personal service and trust meaningfully into digital channels for the first time. And the way they did that was by integrating. Now we would on the outside call this chat, but if I say chat to you, you immediately think, oh, that's not innovative at all, Lee. What chat inside digital banking? No. This is something different. It bears mentioning here and describing because it is beginning a brand new era inside of banking that I'm calling personal digital. We've been talking about personalization forever inside of digital banking channels, but personalization is just some application of data analytics that brings to bear more relevant data and or information to the customer or member in a self-service mode. That's what personalization means, but it's kind of a misnomer because it sounds warm and fuzzy, but it's not warm and fuzzy at all because there's not another person there at a moment of need. What we saw come into play in 2018 for the first time, and there are now a couple of hundred community financial institutions across the country doing this, but because they're relatively small, you haven't heard a whole lot about it. But what they've done is they've put their people front and center inside of digital channels at the moment of need, wherever that moment is encountered by a customer or a member. This is the other thing that the pandemic has done. It has forced people who never did any of their banking digitally to do digital banking for the first time. There's about 4 to 5% of the American population who fit that category. There's about a 16% of American consumers who are now using digital banking a lot more than they ever did before the pandemic. There's about 12% who are using it somewhat more. And there's about 40 to 50% of the population that were already using digital banking regularly and they continue to use it. What I'm trying to bear out by mentioning all of that is that the proficiencies represented by people using the digital channel for money and banking context is now a much broader range of proficiencies. And those different constituencies reach the limit of self-service at many different places along the way. And so therefore you can't design around the averages anymore, which means to say, I can't assume that Bill and everybody else is going to reach the limit of self-service here inside of my digital banking app. And so that's where I need to make sure I've got a personal service option. This is all about making digital full service. This is really what I'm trying to describe, where the transition that's going on is digital as self-service to full service, where you've got a hybrid model where real people can talk to other real people in and at their moments of need. In digital banking, that is made more complicated because of all of the regulation. You've got to be authenticated, you've got to be encrypted end to end. You've got, you got to check all these boxes. But we're now on the third generation. Now, again, most people don't even know we're in this new personal digital era. You might get a hint of it if you look outside of banking. If you look at TurboTax saying, hey, talk to a live CPA. When you reach your limit of self-service inside of TurboTax, here's a live CPA. H&R Block did the same thing, right? They were all in person, and then they went all online, and now they're pivoting back to a hybrid model, and they're differentiating on, you can talk to a live local person. They're giving that option. So the hybrid is where you have to be if digital is going to be full service, not just reduced to self-service the way it's been historically. And this is something to pay attention to, not just in banking, but across every vertical that any and all of your fintechs or your entrepreneurs or your people in incubators are looking at. The technology philosophy that's kind of not going away, but it's receding now, but has been in predominance for the last 20 years. The technology philosophy has been technology is applied so that you never have to speak to anyone, so that we don't have to have support personnel on our side, so we can reduce headcount, so we can reduce costs, right? But what we're learning is that there are some contexts in which you will always and forever need to have a personal support option, and money is absolutely at the top of that list of areas in which people, when, think about it. Think about the primal fear that you have when you you're going to check on your money. How much money do I have? And you go into that thinking, okay, I should have roughly, you have a rough balance in your head. And then you check in with your digital banking and that balance is nowhere near what you thought it would be. Now you begin to freak out a little bit. You're scanning through transactions. You see 3 that are completely alien to you. You're freaking out even more. And here's what we've learned behaviorally is that it doesn't matter how digitally proficient you are in a moment of need like that. It doesn't matter what age you are, how much money you have, what ethnographic, demographic, psychographic you belong to. All you want to do is talk to someone that can resolve that moment of need at the first point of contact, and you prefer to be someone with whom you have some continuity in history. This is why at Jack Henry, we're so bullish on the future of community financial institutions, because we see them being able to differentiate against the mega banks on live, local, personal trust and service inside of digital channels that the mega banks will never be able to pull off. And it's not just that they can't pull it off, they won't, because it is diametrically opposed to their philosophy of technology and its application. Just the same way it is for most tech startups in Silicon Valley. It's the same technology philosophy. But this means also this to me, if you understand this shift, you see where there's really blue ocean opportunity in these digital full service models, or bringing them to market in and across all verticals. There's just unlimited opportunity for differentiation and monetization, because now, as we've seen, there is a premium there's a premium on trust. We are seeing the bedrock of institutions and everything all being questioned, and some of it coming crumbling down. So in that context, trust commands a higher premium. And that's where we think community financial institutions are not just a good thing. We think we think at Jack Henry, we believe that you can't have strong communities without strong community financial institutions. And we think that if you look at that in aggregate, that is what's behind the juggernaut of the American economy. I mean, no one else has a banking ecosystem like ours in the world. Nobody has, thousands and thousands and thousands of financial institutions. It's all consolidated. It's all centralized, Bill, to use your language, right? So that's another way of looking at, another lens through which to look at this. I'm very bullish on the decentralization of banking, and we can talk about that technologically. But I also look at that as, again, the how community financial institutions, chartered community financial institutions, are pivotal, maybe seminal, to that decentralization of our banking ecosystem. And without it, I just know this, without it, we're not better off. We're not better off without community financial institutions. We're not better off without relationship-based banking and money, in and around money, because that's the highest, that's seminal to everything else that a person does, right? Is how financially healthy are you? How can you understand your money? What should you do next, et cetera? So.
And is there, like, you've sold me on it, imagining not having to frantically press 0 and say talk to a person when I call Chase.
Right.
But is it
right.
easy to sell these community financial institutions on this technology? It might be kind of like a biased perspective, but I think of them as probably being later adopters.
Yeah, well, both and. So they are typically behind the curve in technological adoption. The mistake strategically that they need to avoid making is trying to compete with a Bank of America on Bank of America's terms, or Wells Fargo on Wells Fargo's terms, because they can't. They will never have the granularity of self-service optionality that a Bank of America or a Wells Fargo can provide. However, they can offer enough functionality to functionally close the gap, right, between the self-service offering at a mega bank and their own self-service offering. But what's going to take them over the top and differentiate them is this personal service that comes into play immediately, on demand, at the moment of need, inside of digital. The master KPI for this, by the way, if this gets watched by any of the techies out there, the software engineers, et cetera, the master key performance indicator around which all of our software engineering is happening now at Jack Henry is a KPI called moment of need to resolution. So that's a way of thinking about, if you look at the history of banking, there was always a trade-off between the quality of the engagement and the convenience of the engagement. So if you wanted high quality face-to-face service, right, you had to go to a branch, or you had to call and maybe listen to terrible Muzak. People even know what Muzak is anymore. Listen to Muzak and then wait and maybe get bounced around and eventually talk to the right person who can resolve your moment of need. But so what's the best mon to res? That's my shorthand for moment of need to resolution. What's the best mon to res KPI in those historical settings? an hour, 15 minutes, an hour a day, depending on if you actually wanted to go to the branch and when you could carve out time to go there. So now think about what I've described to you just came online in 2018. Now you can literally be freaking out because of that balance that doesn't make sense, or the transactions that you see there that you're worried are fraudulent. And you can immediately tap to begin a conversation that is already authenticated, therefore it can already be candid, and you don't have to identify who you are, what account you're talking about, or even the transactions in question, because in these third generations of these secured conversation threads that are now showing up inside of digital banking, you don't even have to describe, not only do you not have to remember your account number, no one ever can, you don't even have to describe the transaction. You can literally tap them or drag and drop them into the conversational thread. So think about that. Every noun inside of a digital banking context can be attached inside of a conversational thread to expedite the resolution of the need. So now what we're talking about is we're talking about not only just true relationships, where I'm having that conversation with somebody whose name and face I know and recognize from the local branch where I've gone in whenever I have gone in, right? But it's happening on demand in real time. So this historical trade-off of, well, you can either have high quality engagement or you can have the convenience of lesser quality self-service. You can have one or the other, but not both. We've now busted that down. You now can have both at the same time, and community financial institutions can differentiate on that very thing. And I call this relationship at speed. This is so new. I keep trying to come up with, different ways of talking about it and language for it. But relationship at speed is a brand new thing in the universe. In the context, I should say this, in the money universe, it's a brand new thing. So this to me bodes really well. I think you will see community banks I know you will. We're already seeing it. We saw this with the PPP loan rounds that came out, right? For small businesses. Who did the best at that? In these relationship intensive, like time critical moments of need, who did the best at getting those loans into the hands of small businesses so they could save their employees? Well, that was community banks and credit unions who did the best job of that. And by the way, I don't know if you noticed this in the Wall Street Journal this week, what are the mega banks who got caught red-handed prioritizing their largest corporate interests to get their PPP loans done first, and they're making $100,000 a pop just to help those big businesses fill out a PPP loan application, right? And everybody's like, hey, you're not helping small business. You're damn right they weren't doing that first. It was priority order, big to small. What are they doing now? They're saying they're going to give up their profits off of the PPP fees. They're going to donate those to local communities now. They're trying to buy their way out of the bad will, the ill will they created, with the way they handled the actual moment of need for small businesses around the country. But community banks and credit unions were there, staying up all night, literally people staying up all night to try to get, these loan applications shoved through the bottleneck at SBA. And they just went above and beyond. And you're now seeing community banks. By the way, there's a community bank in Colorado called High Plains Bank. They opened more accounts over the course of the pandemic than they did in all of 2019 because of the word got out about what they were doing to save small businesses in the community. And they did that with their branches closed, by the way, also because of the pandemic. Did it all through digital channels. But they're one of those couple of hundred community financial institutions in the country who are doing relationship at the moment of need personally inside of digital. And I think that's just and then you're going to see more and more of that accrue to the benefit of these community financial institutions and their communities for that matter.
Haley, can I ask you a question from something you mentioned earlier when you said in 4 months you've been on, what was it, 60 podcasts and everybody and their mother has a podcast. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your strategy. If you were talking to an entrepreneur who wanted to go a little bit further in that direction, what I would call thought leadership as a way of acquiring leads or
Right.
acquiring business. How do you go about getting on these 60 podcasts, choosing which podcasts to go on, deciding should I spend my time on a podcast or should I write a guest blog or should I post on social media? And especially with the podcasting, because does seem to be somewhat of a newer channel for thought leadership because everybody and their mother has a podcast. But that also means that, hey, you're spending an hour or two on this podcast and 5 people are going to hear it, the mother's son and about it.
Right.
So how do
Maybe
you
just like
kind of
meeting here right now, like this one?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, so I would tell you that the short answer is to ladder up. So, but the lens you want to bring to that is you want to know, okay, where are, in terms of who I want to hear what I have to say, where are those people congregating, whether it's online or in historically physical gatherings or conferences or associations or whatever the case may be. You want to identify where your target audience is, where they hang out, what they consume, which publications online or places online do they pay most attention to. You want to do that through the lens also of quantifying the listenership or the readership of those particular outlets, right? So the bigger those outlets are, the more difficult it is to get your foot just in the door without having any history or a connection or a relationship that gets you seen or heard or paid attention to by the people running those outlets. Now, typically, later on, when you can hire a PR firm to figure all this stuff out for you, this is exactly what they do. They say, well, okay, Lee, you've got a particular viewpoint that's really interesting and maybe compelling and relevant to the moment. How do you get that out there? The ladder up is, if you're going to be on I'll give you an example. The biggest fintech podcast in the world is Brett King's Breaking Banks. Okay, it just is. It's got the biggest listenership around the world. It's hard to get on Brett's podcast unless you either pay to play, right? Which you're trying to avoid. That's not what you want. Or Brett knows you, or you've said something that is so interesting and so counter-conventional that Brett wants to get you on the podcast to unpack it in front of his audience, right? So if you don't want to pay to play, which I would say, you don't really want to do that if you can avoid it, then the way to work that is try to get on Brett King's radar, right? Take a position, and this really gets back to what I learned at Duke, by the way. By the way, can I give a shout out to, I don't know if you see this guy back here, that's Reynolds Price. So Reynolds Price, I was at Duke during Reynolds Price era. Stanley Fish, and I was an English major and an econ major. English was my first love. My dad then laughed and said, "Great, what real degree are you going to get to justify this tuition?" And I added econ. But anyway, Reynolds and Stanley and all of that they had, just a rock star English department when I was there. And they said, you got to know your audience, right? Art is about what you do with expectations. And the best art is the art that most wonderfully violates expectations. So to get seen, to have any currency in the economy of attention, you have to take a counter-conventional position to the received wisdom of the moment. All right? And you just go ahead and you disembowel it, by the way. This is the way to do it. If you see this light, fluffy, conventional wisdom, let me give you an example. So, by the way, I'll give you an example. Brett King, who built this media empire on saying that banks were going away and fintechs were going to rule the world. Okay, he built an entire media empire. I've been calling Brett King out as being wrong for 15 years in very public places, right? But he's adorable and he's smarter than me and he's Australian and he has this beautiful accent. So everybody that hears him talk believes everything that he says, right? But I am always calling him out and saying, no, Brett forecast 15 years ago that banks were all going to be gone by now. And he was wrong. And why was he wrong? And let's talk about that. And so but Brett establishes, you know, in my world, Brett often establishes the received wisdom, right? And if you can identify the received wisdom, then you're going to look to see if there's a case to be made for the counterpoint. And if you're first to make the counterpoint, you will get a disproportionate amount of attention in your particular vertical in your industry. And then people are going to want to know more about why you say that. And then they're going to want you to write an article. And then they're going to want to have you on their podcast. And then that podcast is going to get heard by a bigger podcast. And they're going to want you to come on that one. So that's the laddering up. But I would tell you this, and this is not just about trying to get your fintech seen or your startup heard or get yourself some visibility. This is core to the way I navigate the world. If you want people to pay attention to what you're saying, say something that they have not heard before. And if you really want to get their attention, say the opposite of what they have heard before. And then make the case for why what they thought is wrong. And then they will, scales will fall from their eyes. And if you amuse them a little bit while you're doing that, they will then think you're a rock star. And then they will start offering you, keynote positions at these unbelievably big conferences. And that's exactly the ladder up that I did over a year.
Before you ladder up, you got to at least be on the first rung of the ladder, because if I have a message that's counter to what I hear in the ed tech industry,
yep,
and I say it out loud on this call, nobody cares, right? Nobody's going to hear it. Nobody's going to want me to get on their podcast. So how do I start talking about that message for anybody to even hear about it?
Let me give you a great question. You got to navigate that through relationships. You've got to actually work to get, some connections established to people that are listened to in the industry. And then you literally, if you make that connection with them, literally ask them, hey, I wrote this article. Tell me what you think about it. And if you think that it is important and it resonates with you, can you help me share that? Can you share that out on social media? I've got several friends of mine that write for Forbes, right? I got Ron Shevlin. By the way, if you want a case study in who does this better than anybody else in our industry, look at Ron Shevlin in the banking industry. Ron Shevlin. He has an article for Forbes. He's the director of research for Cornerstone Advisors. He is the most cantankerous, counter-conventional, just curmudgeon ever, and people love him because they adore his snark. But he backs up the snark with data and just eviscerates conventional wisdom in our industry. I love this guy for that purpose. But there's another person. So I know several people who write for Forbes. One just wrote his first article for Forbes. It's a guy I know a little bit, not well. I had a connection with him on LinkedIn. He just sent me a DM 3 days ago and said, Lee, I'm starting as a new column with Forbes. I wrote this article about, can't remember exactly what the article was about, but it was excellent. It was historically informed, counter-conventional, and was warning everybody that the loosening of the Volcker rule, what that's going to do, and pointed to SoftBank as a possible future cautionary tale for the industry, right? I read this thing. It was really a little too long for a Forbes article, but it was absolutely pristine in the way it was argued and compelling. It was a compelling read. And I said, this is different. Needs to be said. I've not heard anybody else saying it or laying this history out this way and applying it to the moment this way. I'm going to share the hell out of this, right? And so suddenly this friend of mine, Jeff, now I share it, and then other people see it, and then they go, oh, who's Jeff Gappison? And blah, 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 blah. And it goes, and that's how you ladder up. You start with targeted relationships and then make the ask. Just ask the person, the, mover shaker, the person that's got has got a listenership or readership or whatever. Just make the ask, just make a connection. If you can do something for them, do that for them. That's the way people warm each other up if they don't know each other previously. Be selfless, help them out, and later on they'll want to help you. I'll give you. Oh, I know we're beyond. Oh, we're 1 minute. I'm going to give you one more story. So, And Jen, do you know Adrian Harris, who was Obama's fintech strategist and special advisor?
I know the name, and I
Okay.
was going to give you guys one more great example to follow too. But go
Okay.
ahead.
Let
I have
me
a good
finish
one
this
for
one, and then I
you.
want to hear that one. But so Adrian Harris, in my mind, like Adrian Harris walks on water. Like she has just done so many amazing things in her career. She has deep domain expertise in fintech, venture, policy, law, derivatives. You go down there, and she's just this unbelievable brain and powerhouse, right? And she's also very human and very approachable and very personable. I got connected. I heard her on a podcast. I reached out to her on LinkedIn. She didn't know me. She reached back. We had a phone call. We realized that our worldviews align. I said, I would love for you to come keynote at our conference inside of Jack Henry. She's like, yeah, I'd love to do that, blah, blah, blah. And now when I just posted something the other day on LinkedIn, Adrian Harris liked it with a thumbs up, And to me, it was like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. Adrian Harris just liked anything that I just put out there. And suddenly, because Adrian Harris liked it, then a lot of other people are at least going to pay attention to what I put out there. And that's exactly how all of this works. I'm going to shut up and let Jen give us her.
No, just another great example of a personality that takes a strong opinion, can back it up, super snarky and sarcastic, and super smart British guy, Dave Birch. I don't know if you know him.
Yeah, I know Dave.
Dave is
Absolutely.
great. And he's another terrific example of that ladder up. So I think it's the authentic writing that he did, and then that social media following. And then what he explained to me was, once he published, not that everyone's going to publish a book, but the point is original content. So once he published a book, that sent his keynote speaking career on the next level, right? So now he's paid significant, like probably Ron and some of the other guys. But it was, I think, that the opinion and the authenticity of the writing. I think that's what's been interesting to follow. And I think people want diverse opinions. They don't want to just hear, oh yeah, I agree with that. It's like every panel that you attend, when every panelist says, yeah, I agree with that, you're like, all right, well, I'm just going to leave. I'm falling asleep here.
Yeah, I want to.
So I always encourage my panelists. So I'm hosting, for example, I'll leave this final example. I was looking for diversity of opinion in insurance from diverse thinkers. I found this woman, 30-year veteran, woman of color in insurance, 30 years. Like, can you imagine? So I have her on my panel coming up on Friday, but I found her because she wrote a piece that I thought was super compelling and telling her story. And so anyways, that's just another example. I think it does start with that publishing, writing, sharing, supportable opinion, I guess.
And let me just say this, just to bear out everything that Jen just mentioned, but behind the scenes, even though Ron Shevlin will just make fun of Brett King and the way he thinks of things, Brett King, backstory, Brett King helped Ron understand how to do decent visuals for a keynote presentation. So even though they publicly spar with each other and disagree and make fun of each other, they're helping each other. Ron's track Ron's been writing columns forever, snarky columns forever, and then he put it into a book called Smarter Bank, I think, or something like that, Smart Bank or something like that. And then boom, he just went up a whole nother level. And then Forbes picked him up, and now he's just in the stratosphere. He's got so many opportunities, he can't shake a stick at them. But all of these people and a lot of them, they know each other, they help each other, especially when they recognize, okay, you're original, you're authentic, you've got your own thing. And, that me being attached to you, even if you are diametric to what I'm about, just actually accrues to the benefit of both of us to be connected in some way, personally or professionally. So yeah, it's negotiated through a lot of it through relationships for sure.
Great.
Well, I have more questions, but I think we're out of time. So.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was going to say we're coming up on time, but this has been fantastic. And yeah, I've got so many more questions that I would have loved to ask. So thanks again for doing this, Lee.
Sure.
It's been great.
Thank you, Lee.
Yeah, absolutely.
That
No,
is great.
It's been a lot of fun. I told my dad that my alma mater wanted me to do something for them, and I think he now finally feels like his tuition was justified. That something good.
Then my week was made, so I feel like I've done something for
You have.
you
You've made an old man very, very happy. So for that, I thank you, Jen. Thank you guys for taking time out, and I look forward to sitting in on some future versions of these as you bring more people through and helping add to that queue. So
yeah, great. Yeah, because next week we've got another Georgia native coming up. It's David Cummings.
oh yeah, David's the real deal. Yeah, he's the real deal, right? That's somebody who's actually accomplished something. So that'll be a good change up from this week.
Yeah, this is good.
Well, and let's like collectively let's like promote the program too, like even as attendees, right? So let's get the word out about David's session, and
Sure.
obviously, if you're comfortable, we can share
Yeah.
this session as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy on all those counts. Happy to do that.
Okay.
Okay.
Excellent.
All right. Well, thank you guys.
Thanks,
you.
Lee.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Good to meet you
Take
all.
care.
All right. We'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.